It's my pleasure to introduce my friend, colleague, Chris Fisher. Chris is a partner and chair of the telecommunications practice at Cuddy Fetter, former managing partner. He's a founder and past president of NISWA, as you heard earlier from Paul. He was the appointee to the New York State Cellular Task Force that studied rural issues of deployment. City and State Power 50, U.S. Best in Super Lawyer and Communications Law, right below someone else. And if I'm the dean, he's the president of the university. So please welcome Chris Fisher.
Thanks, Dave. And we also want to thank our session sponsor and source of this morning. Appreciate the support here. So we've got a great panel. I know folks are in the other forum, kind of the exhibit hall, so they'll be making their way in. Really pleased to have four folks who are at the forefront, particularly within the private sector and the public sector when it comes to broadband funding, and wireless. So immediately to my right, Josh Breitbart. Josh, formerly with the City of New York, very involved in some of the mobile broadband and other broadband strategies for the city, including the Internet Master Plan. Just a week and a half ago, confirmed and appointed to his new role as the Senior Vice President at Connect All, which is the New York State Broadband Office. So he's only got $1 billion budget and a lot of work ahead. To his right, Bill Farber. Bill and I go way back. Bill is someone who is on the public sector side of this with us, and Bill has been a real champion for wireless, particularly in the North Country. Bill is a former chair of the Hamilton County Board of Supervisors. He's been involved in public safety. He chairs a committee at the New York State Association of Counties, and he's been a real friend to NISWA and a great collaborator, so we're really pleased to have Bill with us. Beyond Bill, Ethan Lucarelli. Ethan is Wireless and International Advisor to Chair Rosenworcel at the FCC. Ethan's had some stints in Big Law. He's been in commercial satellite. I think now, given his current position, we're going to have to call him the wireless whisperer. And then finally, Lee Davenport. Lee Davenport is Director of Community Development at US Ignite. And US Ignite, as a not-for-profit, is doing a lot of work with Department of Defense, Advanced Wireless, and Lee, in his role, has been really focused on community development, community broadband, bringing together partners, including National Science Foundation and private charitable donations to get some broadband projects off the ground. So welcome, all of you. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I want to get started with Ethan, if you could, and I thought, maybe a view from DC and kind of where the chairwoman's policy priorities are, and give us a little bit of your sense of how it relates to wireless.
Sure, thanks, Chris, and thank you to the association for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've just been telling everybody since I got in how beautiful Saratoga is. I haven't been to the city before, and it's just lovely to see, so wonderful location to be. So thanks for the question. Yeah, I think from the chairwoman's perspective, obviously when it comes to wireless, one of the biggest priorities, of course, is spectrum, right? Making sure that spectrum, which is, as we know, the lifeblood of wireless communications, making sure there's a solid pipeline and enough out there to allow everybody in this room to do their jobs the way they need to do it. So on that regard, I'm pleased to report that recently we closed the bidding on the second mid-band spectrum auction that we've conducted in less than 2 years under the chairwoman's leadership, putting hundreds of megahertz of spectrum into the marketplace, covering not just the most densely populated areas, but actually the most rural parts of the country as well. And so I'm sure that we're all going to be very busy over the next few years deploying that, building those networks, and getting service out to people. But we can't stop there. We need to keep looking for more in that pipeline. And so to that end, the chairwoman has identified the need for more mid-band spectrum. She's pointed to the 7 to 15 gigahertz range in particular as an area of focus. And we look forward to working with all of our partners and stakeholders to try to explore further opportunities there. Related to that, beyond spectrum, another major focus for us has been improving intergovernmental collaboration, both at the federal level, but also our collaboration with states and localities and tribes up and down the ranks. In that respect, we put a lot of energy into collaborating within the federal government, rebuilding some relationships that might have been strained in the past with some of our federal agency partners. In that respect, I'm pleased to discuss that recently we did the first update in nearly 20 years of the Memorandum of Understanding that governs the way federal coordination on spectrum matters goes, and I was honored to be asked by the chairwoman to lead those negotiations for the FCC. Beyond kind of the spectrum and the coordination, obviously we're very interested in seeing a successful execution of all of our security and confidence concerns. So that includes the supply chain reimbursement program that I'm sure folks in this room are very familiar with, the efforts that we are required to do under the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act of 2019 to remove untrusted equipment from our communications networks and replace that with trustworthy equipment. That process, the approvals for that went out in July. We're working on some minor budgetary issues that we're trying to nail down on that one, but we're excited to see that program move forward. And at the same time, we've also been directed by Congress to take action by November there was a recognition that we're doing all these steps to get this untrusted equipment out of our networks, but there's a bit of a disconnect because the FCC continues to put its stamp of approval through the Equipment Authorization Program on equipment that's manufactured that we yet know to be untrustworthy. And so last year, the chairwoman saw that and she put a proposal forward to say, let's cut it out. Let's take this untrustworthy equipment out of the Equipment Authorization Program. Apparently, Congress thought it was a pretty good idea because they then passed a law called the Secure Equipment Act of 2021 that directed us to go ahead and take action on that. And we've got a November deadline there by which we have to adopt rules that will stop authorizing this untrustworthy equipment. So I'll stop there because I don't want to take the whole panel, but there's a lot that we're working on, and it's going to touch everybody in this room. So thank you.
Thanks, Ethan. We're going to come back to some questions there. And Josh, maybe you could, a week and a half on the job, $1 billion budget, a lot of planning that's going on, obviously, with the agency to secure BEAD funding and other sources of funding. Can you give us a little bit of where the governor's priorities are and where you see next steps?
Yeah, and it is, I am new to the role, but one of the great things about this position and why it's such an amazing opportunity and why I'm so excited is because I'm coming in, the governor has already laid out a vision for Connect All. It puts digital equity at the focus with a digital equity planning program, and I'll be hiring a director of digital equity in my office focused on that, a rural broadband program, a municipal infrastructure program, an affordable housing program, and a connectivity innovation program, which maybe we'll talk a little bit more about, as well as mapping, promotion of the affordable connectivity program, and looking at regulatory issues and fees that affect the industry. So she laid that vision out. The legislature was active and provided the authorization for it, provided the funding. And so I'm coming in with all of that in place, and it's just a great opportunity to lead. Now, as you said, the next step is engaging with those federal funding programs and fitting those programs and the rules and timelines of that into the expectations and the vision that the governor and the legislature and all of the stakeholders that have already begun to mobilize at the county level throughout the state, regional planning boards, digital equity coalitions have begun to mobilize. So it's just fantastic to be able to come in at this moment. And I would say that my first order of business, putting that all together, is to listen to the vision and the contributions that everybody's ready to make here.
Thanks, Josh. All right, Bill, a little bit of state of play from where you sit. We served on the governor's task force for upstate cellular and mobile issues. Report came out in 2019. Can you share a little bit about that and kind of some of the findings and what you're seeing, particularly in the North Country?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I am from the northern part of New York. I've been chasing all things technology for what seems like a couple of decades now, chasing all things Adirondack and doing a lot with rural New York. The cellular task force report was really, we worked on that on the heels of the new New York broadband program because, those of us that have been involved in working on technology issues recognize that the amount of fiber that we built through the new New York broadband program really gave New York State a leg up, a head start. It put us ahead of other states, and the cellular, that wireless piece, seemed like the next logical step to keep New York State from a technology standpoint in a position where we were really leading the nation and trying to connect up rural areas and trying to make sure we had this digital equity and that we weren't leaving people behind. And so we convened the task force to think about where we go next. What are those next steps? We did that work in 2019. On one hand, people will suggest that COVID sort of caused a pause in that work. It really consumed everybody's time and bandwidth. But in a lot of ways, our experiences during COVID only reinforced and made more relevant all the work that we had done on broadband, the new New York broadband program, building fiber, and the work of the cellular task force, because all of a sudden, even more so than what we'd seen over the decade before, technology was an absolute critical necessity for our people, for our population, for our constituency. In terms of the report itself, that effort tried to bring people together. We know that building out wireless infrastructure in rural areas, there isn't a silver bullet. It's not throw money at it. It's not to tell the industry they have to do it. We are all in it, and we're part of the solution because, frankly, we all contribute to the problem. So if you're in local government, we heard this mentioned earlier, and it was discussed as part of the discussion within the cellular task force. The fact that if you're from the Adirondacks, for a long time, the Adirondack Park Agency has been critiqued on the way they dealt with towers and the way. The strength, though, by contrast, that we talked about within that cellular task force report is here is one jurisdictional entity that has the regulatory authority for the 101 towns and villages of the Adirondacks. Think about from a provider standpoint, the value then of all of us working together and working us with that one regional regulatory entity to figure out how to do it. So you're not having to guess what 103 or 101 now towns and villages are going to think about this project or that project. So the crux of the work was to really identify and get a handle on the problem. What are the areas where there aren't service? And then think about within sort of the complex landscapes of the Catskills, the Adirondacks, and then other regional areas. How would we do this build out? How do we use small cell and macro sites? What does that look like? What needs to be subsidized? And I think the state of play right now with respect to that report is we're in a great place to start implementing it. You got huge amounts of federal money coming to build fiber. Fiber's the biggest cost driver for getting some of this in place. It's really a matter of figuring out how to partner with the wireless industry to get some of these projects across the finish line.
Thanks, Bill. And Lee, just something that Bill touched on, and I know that US Ignite, I mean, you've really become an organization that's go-to for not just NSF and other federal programs, but really pulling together private charitable donations on some of these issues, especially with digital equity. Can you share a little bit about what you saw during the pandemic, and is some of that activity, particularly in the charitable side, going to persist post-pandemic?
Yeah, no, and thanks for having us join this panel. It's a conversation I think that it's certainly timely if you're thinking about how did grant making or giving or funding, financing change in the pandemic. I think before we were thinking about connectivity, even as 2018-19, it was a privilege, right? If you had $10, you could get it, right? And I think after we had kind of a moment to reflect on do communities have a role in educating all children equally. That was a motivating factor, right? And a single use case for which I think many communities had to face. After that, there has been, to me, I see a lot of alignment around, well, if we care a lot about, third graders getting online, then do we also care about air quality, right? Do we care about how the quality of air related to redlining that may have happened before our time, how does that impact our community? How does the effect of water management, stormwater management, how does that affect our community equally? And I think you've seen the increased role of municipalities in making those decisions. And in 2 years fast forward, they realize that the school district itself cannot solve connectivity in elementary school without the help of the funders and the providers. In the same way, Syracuse can't solve air quality issues by itself without the University of Syracuse, without the Environmental Protection Agency. So what we've seen, I think, is a modification of what we think a collaboration might be. And so it's not just a P3 model, what we talked about in theory of shared value, shared money. It really does seem more to me like a real opportunity to change the landscape of how we think about partnerships. And I think it's been the big change for me.
Thank you. So Ethan, I'm going to come back to you, and maybe all the panelists can talk a little bit about some of the current funding and planning that's going on. Now that we got a little bit of the state of play, RDOF's been in the news. Fixed wireless, obviously, for this crowd is a hot topic. Something that maybe you could comment a little bit on in terms of where the FCC sees fixed wireless and some of the funding criteria and solutions that might be available there.
Sure. Happy to talk about that. So, the Rural Development Opportunity Fund, I'm sure people have seen a little discussion of that. Major funding opportunity for fixed broadband. Primarily the emphasis has been on fiber to the premises deployments. That, by the numbers, has been the vast majority of the applications received in RDOF, and accordingly has accounted for the vast majority of the funding that's been awarded. That said, RDOF is not a fiber program. It's a fixed broadband program. And it's technology neutral in its basis and its intention. So we have been giving money for fixed wireless as well, in particular, and especially on kind of hybrid fiber/fixed wireless deployments. But it's incumbent upon the applicant to demonstrate that they can meet the requirements of that program. And that includes convincing the FCC network engineers that the proposal you have forward can meet those capacity and delivery requirements, and that you as a company are able to successfully deploy and efficiently use the funding that's being awarded. So there have been hundreds of millions of dollars given out for hybrid fiber fixed wireless programs, and we're excited to see the impact that that's going to have.
So Josh, just to pick up on what Ethan's talking about in terms of RDOF focused on some of those opportunities, obviously you've got a ton of planning that's going on, and this room, not surprisingly, is a little bit more wireless focused maybe than fiber, but it all goes together. BEAD, some of these other programs that you're now going to come up with state plans for. Can you give us a little sense of priorities there? And one of the big questions I think this group would love to hear is how best to engage with you. I mean, you're gonna get a lot of stakeholders coming at you from all different directions. How does this group effectively help you do your job for planning?
First, I hope I get stakeholders coming at me from all directions. It was not too long ago that you had to really go out and get those stakeholders to engage and have these conversations, and needed leaders like Bill to mobilize those conversations. So I love the fact that people are so engaged at this point, and that will be so core to it, is getting the perspectives of the folks in this room, folks in other rooms, the folks not in any rooms at this point, to weigh in on what they think. Chris, that I do see connectivity as being inclusive of mobile and fixed, and Bill, I think this is what you were saying. You need a gig in the home and 5G on your phone, and those are going to continue to grow. And the funding programs have their requirements in them, and preferences or certain requirements that need to be met. So I think that those are the things that we're going to consider as we look to roll this out. But certainly, again, the core infrastructure of fiber is something that every technology is going to be agreeing on and looking at. So we'll be considering that. But I'm certainly interested to hear how these fixed broadband programs and these fiber deployment programs can coalesce with mobile deployment efforts and the perspective of others on the role that fixed wireless can play, either as a solution in particularly challenging areas, potentially if people want to make that case, or as a way to drive competition. And certainly we're seeing it play that role in a number of different markets now, from with the mobile entrants in that space, as well as the traditional WISPs.
I think Josh should give him a call. No, but I really appreciate that. And I think, Bill, this would be a conversation that ties in, given your role and some of the work that came out of even the task force. The task force said,
Absolutely.
Ballpark it, it's a $600 million mobile issue to get through to rural coverage. How do you see some of this playing together from where you sit and what you see?
I do think that there's a natural partnership here, and a couple of us were talking about the Washington landscape and work that I'd done at NACO going back to 2019 and prior to that, in that New York State really is ahead of where other states were. And so some of us that were going to NACO from New York were talking about this intersection differently. And we were frankly talking about the intersection differently because we were farther evolved in the fiber build within New York. And so we were starting to transition our thinking to what we knew consumer demand was going to be pushing for next, and that was the wireless piece. But I think it remains in play, and it's a natural partnership as we look at building out the fiber money, the broadband, the fiber to the home, broadband to the home, all of those technologies, in that in New York, we have the hardest of the hard to serve areas are what's left because of the success of the new New York broadband program. So what does that mean? During the new New York broadband program, one of the lessons learned was it was very difficult to get providers to step in and say, even with a subsidy, I am interested in building that, because they were worried about whether they could sustain the network afterwards. Where were the customers going to be? How did the business model work? Well, I think there's no question that the wireless piece in some of these areas of New York, the Adirondacks and the Catskills, that are heavy tourism markets, where you've got your customers and our communities really coming together in a way that your customers are demanding service in those areas. Your customers are also part of the customer base those fiber builds are going to depend on. We just have to figure out how to build that wireless piece into our thought train, into our planning. And so, frankly, a lot of the communities in our area as a region, we're starting to think about and plan for broadband and wireless cellular together, recognizing that there in the middle, there's also the fixed wireless and the instances where you've got a lake, where there's no way you're going to be able to make the economics work to build fiber 360 degrees or even 180 degrees to get around a lake. You've got an opportunity with fixed wireless to have one facility provides fixed wireless, provides a tower with roads, with utility infrastructure for the cellular industry. There's a lot of magic in bringing this all together and planning in a comprehensive way. And frankly, when you think about the opportunity to serve these hardest to serve areas, it's the only way the economics are going to work for all of us to get it done.
And if I could just add on to that, I think the key there is, when the federal government acts, they tend to act, in a silo. They create a funding program to solve this, or they create a policy solution or a program to solve this. And the reason, why the opportunity we have now with mobilizing my office, but state broadband offices generally, is to provide sort of the first line of coordination to that, and then to partner with regional planning boards is a great infrastructure we have in New York, to try and put together the comprehensive plan. And then, together we try and figure out, okay, we've got this tool from the federal government, this funding source, this set of private stakeholders, and this is how we can put it together to match what's needed locally. I think we will blow this opportunity if what we do is just be a transparent silo conduit from the federal government to local initiatives. So that's really the planning work I think that we have ahead of us in the next year particularly.
Thank you. And Lee, just to follow up on that, I mean, Josh and Ethan were really talking about a lot of different broadband funding sources. You actually at US Ignite developed a tool because I think that's one of the things that, even people who are in the know, there's like brand confusion of what tool, what technology, what's the criteria. And, for folks in the audience, they're not going to go read 100 pages on a, agency, like an NTIA when they came out, right? I mean, I dove in, but it's 100+ pages to figure that out.
Well, that's why they hire you.
So, but the tool, I think could really be beneficial, especially for folks in this audience, because a lot of folks here are entrepreneurial, and they're looking, a lot of times I think our industry gets lumped up with, big telco. There's a lot of folks here doing great creative projects, particularly all across New York. So how does this tool and how does some of those resources help them?
Sure. I think a lot of the attention goes towards NTIA's money. It's 42. I know it's not 200 million from the last panel, but there are big dollars out there. 42, 2.5. There are billions of dollars. We're tracking. In addition to that, the CARES Act, obviously, there's 90 plus federal funding opportunities we bring together. It includes just any agency that's putting money out. And I think to counter the discussion point that there are siloed dollars, if you hear wireless or fiber or fixed wireless as being a component of a program from commerce or transportation, if vehicles have to move across geopolitical lines, if air moves as it wants to, if sound and light and public safety officials need to move, they need the same infrastructure. And so it's easy enough to think that while they may be siloed funding dollars, the solutions can be, you can imagine how a solution might use the same infrastructure, and you can the application itself, we coach our cities on this. The application itself is a representation of a partnership. It is not, the hard part is not writing the words, the hard part is doing all the work to get the words to match the intentions of the partners that are in the room and to expand the scope of the partnership so you get the right fit. If you are out there and not talking to a municipality about the things they need to solve, the challenges they face, I feel like you're missing the boat there, because many times the municipalities, the states, the cities, they need to work with infrastructure partners, startups, academics to enrich their application. And once they have this coalition of the willing built, you can get any dollar, right, from EPA or energy or education or commerce, transportation, because all these things will need something, and they need to trust locally that you're holding each other accountable to that end that you imagine where the aligned objective is. And so I think there's just tons of money out there. And while a lot of attention goes, I think this is interesting, Ethan, what had said about you should note, not only is there oversubscription of applications, 5, 10 times the number of applications, NSF awards 8% of all applications. Not only are there oversubscription of funds that Josh will be dealing with too, you also have what you had said earlier, right? Many applications, most applications, most awards, right? And so if you aren't getting your money into that, they can't award based on their interest. They have to award based on what's there. And so make sure that your coalition partners are putting your applications in as often as they can. It's hard, but NSF has made it easy. EDA has made it relatively easy. And I encourage you to do that.
Thanks. So let's shift gears a little bit. Just a couple of other things that I know are hot topics for this crowd. Ethan, I don't know how much you can talk about it because it's a proceeding that's open, but the mapping, broadband mapping has been much anticipated. What can you tell us about that process-wise, and maybe just like looking forward some FCC policy goals that might come out of that?
Yeah, and thanks, Chris. Yeah, obviously, This is an active situation that's developing by the day, but for those who aren't familiar, which maybe that's a null set, we're talking about the broadband data collection, which is something that the FCC established pursuant to the requirements of the Broadband Data Act of 2020. And what this is it's an exercise in collecting much more accurate information about commercial mass market broadband availability in this country than we've had before. So you might be familiar with our Form 477, which we've used for many years to collect broadband availability data, an important tool and some very valuable data, but some limitations on that tool. For fixed broadband, it collected data at a sort of census block level. Which doesn't necessarily give the same granularity that you might look for in certain instances. And on the mobile side, it gave a lot of leeway to mobile providers in how they were going to define and describe what they were putting in. With BDC, that changes. So on the fixed side, BDC collects location-specific data based on this tool that's been developed called the Broadband Serviceable Location Framework, which is essentially a database that lists every structure in the country that is or could receive fixed broadband. And so that's going to allow us to have much more granular site-specific information. On the mobile side, for the first time, we're going to be collecting data based on standard specifications from all the mobile providers that will allow us to better assess the accuracy of filings, as well as kind of do some side-by-side and evaluation of competitive filings. This is a biannual filing, which means we're collecting it twice a year. So the first collection window opened in June and closed just at the beginning of this month. Where we go next is to what we call the challenge process. So there's an opportunity for all stakeholders, including state governments, local governments, tribes, service providers, and individuals, to take shots at this data. Both the fabric itself and the filings that come in from the carriers. The goal is to create this kind of continuous improvement process. So our first maps, which are expected, by the way, in the November timeframe, are not going to be our last maps, right? We know that those first maps that go out are not going to be perfect. That's expected. What's important is that we have this iterative process, and we just opened this week the window for what we're calling the bulk challenges to the fabric. So this is for entities like states or service providers that kind of have that bigger view of a region of the fabric, and they can submit challenges to say, hey, we think there's something missing, we think this isn't where you say it is, or so on. And that window is open right now, so I can't say anything in detail about what we're getting there, but we're really looking forward to that first rollout of the maps later this year. That will trigger an opportunity for everybody else to start putting in their individual challenges to say, and this is everything from a carrier saying, the fabric doesn't look right for our area, we know our area, we know where the people are, and this isn't accurate, to an individual saying, hey, I'm not covered, right? And that opportunity is going to open up later this year. We'll see also towards the end of the year. I don't think there's a set timeline, but I believe the commission has said December for the next iteration of the fabric, and that's how we're going to keep building this. Going forward, this data is going to be essential. It's going to be hugely game-changing when it comes to making funding decisions. So the BEAD program that we're all looking at with our eyes wide is going to rely heavily on this, but it's also going to be of great interest to academics, to other parts of the government. I mean, this is going to be a really impressive data set that's going to be hugely influential in decision-making going forward.
Thank you for sharing that. So I know this crowd's probably looking forward to seeing those first maps, and particularly probably Bill.
Well, I mean, the reality is there's been a lot of conversation about broadband maps and the mobility maps going back to that 2019 timeframe. One of the big things the Cellular Task Force did was we did our own mapping, and we had Tilson and a sub that basically went out and drove roads to validate it. Then I made a trip down in December of 2019 to FCC in anticipation of the report, and sat with a team and said, look, what's going to be the process for submitting amendments or corrections to the mobility fund map. Unfortunately, that was a time frame when they were uneasy with what they were even going to do with the maps because they'd identified they're so bad. So looking forward rather than backwards, we're at a really interesting moment in time in that we've all done mapping. So at the local level, we've done broadband maps and we've done cellular maps. The state has done work on broadband maps. PSC is out there right now checking their maps. FCC has done maps. The state right now has an opportunity to make appeals or offer corrections at that federal scale. And the timing of that is not ideal because we're still working on some corrections and some evolution of the PSC map. We've got some areas in Hamilton County, as an example, where spectrum is still showing up for broad swaths of the community, where they're not even a provider in some of the communities. So we're going to have to act quickly. This does not fall on a lot of you, but stay tuned. We've got a lot of work to do at the local and state level to make sure we're intersecting with those FCC maps. They're going to drive a lot of funding. There's also the mobility fund that will be some of that pure cellular money that will be driven by where that map lands.
So thank you, Bill. And you and I have talked a lot about maps and data, and so it'll be interesting to see what goes next on that for sure. Josh, a little bit of background. I mean, you talked about it and touched on it at the beginning, especially in your new role. Access for New Yorkers, affordability, adoption, access, all the things that go into broadband. And you really have, in the community and your role in New York City, looked at a lot of technical innovation, marrying that up with economic pragmatism. I'm thinking about the Link NYC project, your early work on the 5G mobile franchises, and all the stuff that went into the internet master plan. So how's your thinking, it's early stages for you, but how's your thinking on that and how to scale some of that with BEAD opportunities and where Connect All is going to probably head for the state?
Right. Well, certainly I start out in this role with no assumptions that what applies to New York City applies throughout the state. My mother, who also grew up in Brooklyn, told me, you develop a lot of critical survival skills in New York City that are not useful anywhere else in the world. But I think what is helpful from those experiences is you do have to start with the knowing from the government perspective what it is you want and what vision you have. I think we heard this on the last panel too, that that's what really is a core to being an effective partner to the private sector, is having a clear understanding of what you want, because otherwise you have no way really to evaluate the relative merits of whatever people bring to you, and you'll spin your wheels, stuck in the sort of mud of a lack of clarity and vision. So that to me was, but and then on the contrary, if you have a clear vision, I think that you'll find conversations to have with the private sector. I won't say that there aren't unreasonable people out there in the world, or people with just a really narrow vision of what they want to get done. But by and large, if you're coming to the table with a clear representation of what you see as the public interest, there is a conversation to be had, and it's a great way to drive innovative solutions, including some of the ones that you talked about. I think that's at the core of the vision for the Connectivity Innovation Program that the governor included in the Connect All program, and I think that's something that we'll be looking at and thinking about as we go through the local planning efforts.
Thank you, Josh. Lee, you talked, at the beginning about some of the programming at US Ignite, and one of the things that touches on that you and I had a chance to work on was Project Overcome. You're a little over a year. You've had 2 New York recipients. Maybe you can give the audience a little bit of an overview of Overcome and where you think the results came out and what you might see next for those communities and some of that work.
Sure. Project Overcome was supported by $2.4 million from the National Science Foundation and Schmidt Futures. Thank you if you're in the room. The idea was we would search for and find use cases to apply alternative wireless research in communities to connect with unconnected populations. We ended up with 2 very rural populations, one town of maybe 100 people and 60 households, no stoplights. One was a post-wildland firefighter, post-wildland fire event, a forest fire in Oregon, and then the internal to housing authority and housing partnerships, affordable housing partnerships. We ended up supporting 2 in New York, one in Yonkers, one in Buffalo. These were, again, can we deploy a fixed wireless and wireless solution to connect these populations? I think the thing that really sets the partnership separate or apart in Yonkers, which was so empowering to read in the application and then to manage it and monitor it through the course of the year, was the ways in which the city was approached by a collective of partners, the ways in which the University of Buffalo engaged, the ways in which local nonprofits were engaged, both at the kind of the level of which we thought connectivity should be provided at housing authorities, 40,000 public housing and 120,000 affordable housing units in Yonkers means that there's a highly eligible population for assisted broadband connectivity. The ways in which that those agencies work together to take what was operational capability at its core, to bring in this idea that there's ROI and social good. And so you had to find alignment between, we think, successful collaborations, find alignment between an overlap from this public good, private good partnership. And then to each of the partners, we then validate those operational capability, private good, public good, overlaps with kind of the demand and support which the private sector needs, and then the legitimacy that the public sector needs to show that everyone's making investment to their stakeholders or to the residents of a broader tax-paying population. I think the long term of that population is once you have that alignment, you have carriers will come in. T-Mobile has expressed interest. Crown Castle, who's in the room, I think also, thank you for that, provided backfeed for that partnership, strengthened the signals. We had the city kick in money with device support, and we had local nonprofits that came in with technical training. I actually thought it was a miscalculation at the beginning that the intensive population that would receive a device also had to take a 15-hour digital literacy course. Those populations, it looks like, were no less likely to sign up. The pipeline of people who wanted 15 hours was actually quite strong, and we've yet to see the long-term outcomes. So we're looking to tie economic growth, racial wealth gap. We're looking to understand the economic drivers that happen on credit, debt, and savings, and demographic studies. And so I think that when we have populations that are served with a concerted effort, we'll have this kind of pervasive lift in the community. And so again, I think Yonkers and Buffalo have done a great job in that. So thanks for putting your name in the hat for consideration. You guys have done a great job.
Thank you. All right, we're getting close to the end. I want to get to questions, but last chance for the panelists of kind of looking forward. Been a lot of different conversations. I know, Bill, you brought up Mobile 5G Fund, which is more in Ethan's court. We can start again with you, Ethan, just, for this audience, kind of looking ahead over the next, call it 2 years, FCC priorities, how this group can help and work collaboratively with your agency.
Sure. Thank you for that. Stay in touch, right? Reach out to us. We serve the public, and we have a transparent, open, participatory process. I often say I'm probably the easiest person at the FCC to get a meeting with, right? I always say yes. So if there's something that you want to talk about, reach out and let's do it. Touching on the Mobile 5G Fund and where are we going, kind of, I know that's something that's going to be of great interest here for that group. As Bill mentioned, it's going to rely upon those maps, that data that we were talking about. So earlier, actually last month, we put out a report to Congress on the future of the Universal Service Fund. Chris was talking about these 100-page documents. This one wasn't quite 100, it's 65 pages, but every one of them thrilling, right? We'll be handing out copies with a cup of coffee in the lobby. In that we did talk about mobile support and where do we go from here. There were some who argued that we should not even be thinking about that until BEAD is all said and done, right? Like, let's just make sure that program gets out there. But the commission said BEAD is a fixed program. There's no reason that we need to stand in our tracks on mobile in the interim. However, whatever decision we make about how we structure 5G support, mobile support going forward, it has to take account of that new data, that mapping. So that's a sort of necessary input and prerequisite to being able to move from here. So what you guys should do is, keep honest about that mapping exercise, that data collection, make sure the data is as good as it can be. If you're a carrier, get your data in, get it in as early as possible going forward every time. Don't wait till we always wait for the end of a window. Let's hit the beginning of a window instead. Same with challenges, if you're in a position to do that, help us get that information, because this is going to be an iterative process, and we can't do it without everyone in here's support.
I had a judge once say, why do lawyers always wait till the last minute? And the answer was, because we can. We'll see if we can get some folks to get you the earlier data. I mean, Josh, same question, just from New York and where we're headed, things you want to share with this group.
It is going to get up to speed very quickly. It's going to, I know it's nonstop already for a lot of the people in this room. Since you've been driven by private sector funding, but I do think that the mobilization on the public sector side at all levels of government is going to be really, really critical, and we are going to be focused on that in the local planning efforts, engaging, providing technical assistance, mobilizing the data collection. Not just for the challenge process and refining the state maps, which is critical, but also, at the same time, refining the plans and the visions on the local side, and also, Lee, you touched on this, building the partnerships that go into that. That really, I think, is the critical input. The social infrastructure really is a critical input. To having really successful digital infrastructure. And so I think that's going to be our immediate focus. And I think the key to that, when you talk about how fast we're going to get, how fast these next few years of deployment are going to come at us, is that people have a tendency to want to feel like they're going fast, which sometimes can get in the way of actually going fast. And I think, this is one of those situations where we really want to, make sure that we've got that really solid footing to work together on this.
Bill, from kind of your perspective, same kind of question. Were you?
I really appreciate the chance to be here today, and I think what the panelists are saying is really heartening for me, having worked on this for some period of time. I couldn't be happier at the fact that FCC does recognize the need to work on the fixed and the mobility fund at the same time, because I do think for some of our rural areas, it is that broader collaborative effort that's going to make it work. I think what I would say to all of you is take heart. I think the way local government acted towards wireless a decade ago is evolving. I used to feel like periodically I was the only guy in the room talking about how we should look at ourselves and look at some of our regulations and some of those things. You see more and more municipalities, elected leaders now stepping up and recognizing that. But I do think for the state, as they work through it, for the federal government, the idea of figuring out, and it's probably at the county scale or larger, how to plan for this, but how to engage those most local officials, the town, the city, the village officials, into the conversation so they're part of the plan, have part of the responsibility for getting it done to help diffuse what was in the past, as we all know, at times an adversarial situation that doesn't benefit anybody. Finger pointing is not going to solve this problem. It's going to be a successful collaborative effort that brings together the resources and actually gets our constituents and residents served.
Thanks, Bill. And Lee, you've been doing a lot of work on smart cities with cities, so you're seeing a lot of this collaboration as well. Your thoughts as we conclude.
Yep. What I think that Congress will probably move in the future state, at least, is that as they have done already and indicated with the charging infrastructure, I think you're going to see they're like, oh, we're going to put all this work into fiber and energy, and maybe we should do smart grid, maybe we should do more electric vehicle connectivity. There are cities out there who want to take advantage of these programs. There's billions of dollars for single programs, and you're starting to see electeds and at the state and federal level say we should probably do these at the same time. And so can we use federal dollars within HUD, for example, to increase connectivity in home for public housing? Can we use from within energy or with commerce, middle mile in EDA programming? You've got $1 billion available in middle miles connectivity, not necessarily in the bailiwick of EDA, but helpful for sure for connectivity issues. I feel like the $50 million annual program because coming up from transportation, the SMART program that launches like this month, they're worried that they only have 90 days of a window. And so they're actively looking to make sure people are aware of the program to build smart cities and connectivity into cities. And so I think you have cross-agency use cases that are coming online that will make it a lot easier to go get money. Cities for sure are thinking more broadly about their role and responsibilities in protecting the residents. So public safety, upskilling and training, advanced manufacturing, all these new battery factories are coming. You have Columbus, $100 billion Intel factory. You have battery factories outside of Memphis, outside of Greensboro that are multi-billion-dollar factories. These companies can't hire locally, right? Amazon is going in Arlington, Virginia. They can't hire. They don't know who to hire. You not only need 65,000 cybersecurity professionals in a district like that, you also, that isn't just engineers, it's HR people, it's marketing, it's communications professionals, it's assistants. Like, so we need to train broadly speaking, I think, and that's where I think opportunities will lie.
Fantastic. All right, well, let's see if we got some questions. I know we've got a few minutes left. I'm getting the red sign, which means I've got probably 5 minutes. Right here, John.
Yeah, hi. I'd like to ask about the digital divide that starts at the building wall. I'd like to ask about the digital divide that starts at the building wall. So data shows 80% of mobile calls either originate or terminate inside a building, and Nina says 80% of 911 calls come from a mobile device. So 2 questions, an easy one and a hard one. The easy one for Ethan is, will the mobility mapping include in-building connectivity? And then the harder question is, how does policy need to evolve to recognize that we communicate differently now?
Thanks, John. Appreciate that. Yeah, so I'm going to have to punt on the in-building mapping question. I don't want to say the wrong thing, so we'll have to consult our mapping experts on that. I know that this has been an issue, you know, how we evaluate this in building, out of building, in motion, you know, how do you do the data collection from a moving vehicle, and what are the right specifications and so on. So those technical details are going to be very essential that we get right, so I don't want to say the wrong thing on that. But I do think the larger point, though, about needing to view holistically and take into account the technological solutions and challenges that exist are essential, and it's something that we need to be thinking about as policymakers as well as network engineers and so on. And I think that, you know, as you're very familiar with, I mean, that the role for emergency communications of having robust and reliable coverage as well as location information and so on is essential, and it's something that the FCC on a bipartisan basis for a very long time has cared deeply about, and this chairwoman is no different in her emphasis on making sure that's robust.
And I'll add that I think that this is actually a pervasive challenge because for fixed broadband also. And from the perspective of the public sector, you know, your authority doesn't end at the property line, right? I mean, but it totally changes. And the way government is set up to regulate the public rights of way and engage with private property, it's, you know, I would have the meetings, right? Totally different stakeholders trying to get this to work together. So I think it's actually a really fundamental challenge. I think that we have an incredible opportunity with the affordable housing broadband program that the governor has put forward, and working in partnership with Housing Community Renewal and the affordable housing developers to think through all those needs and all those challenges And I can't promise we're going to get everything right, but I think that these are exactly the types of questions that we should be thinking about as we roll out that program and think about what should building infrastructure be, for the decades ahead to provide a great living environment for those residents and for all New Yorkers.
All right, I'm getting the sign. We're going to end on that note. How about a round of applause for all of our panelists? Great. Thank you, guys. And next event, out the doors, and we'll mill around for a little bit here. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.
Great.